Our lesson for today is entitled, Jesus Stands Trial. We're in Mark chapter 14, and we'll also be in Mark chapter 15. We have 3 points that we will discuss at length, and number 1 is betrayed and arrested. Number 2, before the high priest. And number 3, before Pilate. Our central truth, that focus that we want to really pay attention to, is Jesus displayed humility in the darkest hours of his life, and we want to observe his attitude while he's on trial and try to pattern after his example. Our golden text for this lesson is Mark chapter 14, verses 60 to 61. The high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, saying, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. In our introduction, let's do a little bit of review before we actually get into the trial. It was late in the night when Jesus had ended his last discourse and farewell prayer with his disciples. They have been in their Passover celebration. Judas is already gone. The last hallelujah was over, and the 11 disciples, following their master, went out into the night. They were on their way to Gethsemane. The spirit of Jesus had been calm and serene, but now he faced the most final and severe hours of his life, the awful time that lay ahead of him. Behind him lay his life, before him lay his death, the shame and the derision and the misconception that he would have to endure. Makes you wonder if maybe the temptation that he had in the desert at the beginning of his ministry might have come to him again, that powerful temptation. But he laid aside his divinity to become one of us. He was to become the sacrifice for sin. And regardless of what he had to endure, he would pay the full price that we might be redeemed. His human body was just like ours. And so he absolutely knew what it was to suffer. He knew all about pain that the human body endures. He was to be crucified as a deceiver and a blasphemer. His was a sinless soul. He had never committed a sin. In fact, he was the only perfect human that has ever lived. Down through the ages of our world and the time that it was populated by humanity, he is the only one that was perfect in his lifetime. No human being had ever had the responsibility that Jesus had to become the sacrifice for sin. You see, when Adam and Eve lost their way in the garden and they yielded to temptation, sin was ushered into the world. And from then on, every baby that was born was born into sin. The only way that that awful thing could be broken and the individual could have freedom from that was if there was the blood of a perfect human being sacrificed on a cross, and that blood would be the ransom for the human race. What a responsibility Jesus recognized. He knew the pain, he knew the anguish, he knew the shame that he was about to endure. And as he and his disciples, he has 11 with him now, Judas is gone to betray him. As they pass down the steep sides of the Kidron Valley, and they cross it, they cross the valley to the path that would lead up to the Mount of Olives. Jesus knew that this was his hour. It had come. He had often prayed to his Father on the Mount of Olives. And this night he chose a place that was called Gethsemane. Sometimes when the human soul is overwhelmed with a very heavy responsibility or something that he's facing that is very difficult, he likes to be alone. And so Jesus with his 11 disciples arrive at Gethsemane, and he goes off a little bit farther to take time to pray. He has to have strength from the Father to endure this terrible affliction that will come upon him in just the next few hours. He leaves the disciples at a place where they can rest and takes with him the 3 that usually followed him in specific times, Peter, James, and John. Then he goes on a little bit farther to pray. He passed out of hearing out of the rest of the disciples, and there he began to pray. And he prayed with an anguish of soul. He got through that first prayer and went back to check on his disciples. They were asleep. He prayed with such anguish and strong crying that actually his sweat became great drops of blood, and he cried, "Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless," he said, "it's not my will, but thine be done." He goes back to pray again, but he found the disciples, all of them were asleep. The 3 of his favorite, plus those that had been left at an earlier time. And he said to them, "Couldn't you just watch with me 1 hour? It is best if you watch and pray, because there's going to be a very difficult time ahead of us, and you need that power from prayer to be able to withstand temptation." And he ended with something like this: "The spirit is willing, but the human nature, or the flesh, is weak." So he left them again, went back for the second time to pray. And again he prayed, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." But he said, "If it's not possible, then I will drink it. Thy will be done." And returning to the 3, he found them asleep again. A third time, he talks to the Father. There is an angel that appears to him to give him strength. On this particular night, Gethsemane would become a place of deepest sorrow. The Son of Man would be delivered into the hands of sinners. And that is the background of Mark chapter 14, verse 43. Our first topic is betrayed and arrested. Subtopic A, betrayed with a kiss.
Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with sword and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Question. 1 Timothy 6:10, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." So what results might the love of money have had in Judas's life?
There is a medical term for what happened to Jesus during the time of prayer. I will not attempt to pronounce it, but it is a condition in which the capillary blood vessels that feed the sweat glands rupture. Instead of producing sweat, they ooze blood. This occurs under conditions of extreme physical or emotional stress. And Luke wrote that while Jesus agonized in prayer, that it was his sweat that fell as great drops of blood down to the ground. We will never know the awful pressure that Jesus was under just before he went to the cross. He was human, just like us. He had laid his divinity aside. And he knew that it was not going to be easy. It was a horrible thing that faced him. Meanwhile, Judas, who was not with the bunch, had already gone out into the night, and he had been busy. He'd been exposed and dismissed by the master from the company of the disciples. And so he was determined to carry out his miserable purpose. He hurried through the dimly lit streets to the authorities. That would be the chief priest, even the many priests that resided in the area of Jerusalem. And he reported to them that a favorable time had arrived. He could lead them to Jesus. Jesus had spent a lot of time around the Sea of Galilee in the area of Capernaum in his 3-year ministry. But on this occasion, he had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. It was to be his last with his disciples. And after they had ventured through the night up the Mount of Olives to Gethsemane, to the place of prayer, he had come to the conclusion that he was now in an atmosphere of his own, where he could face what was going to happen to him and face it, because it was to bring salvation and redemption to those who would believe in his sacrifice. When he has been to the disciples for that 3rd time after he prayed, the authorities had come through that same opening in the Mount of Olives, and These were men who acted as the police of the temple. They were armed with clubs. Judas had told them that he could lead them to Jesus, and there was quite a mixture of the band, the many that went to find Jesus. They were armed with clubs. The chief priest and the elders and those who accompanied them were really excited. On this night, they were going to take him as best they could and get rid of him, because they had found him to be a thorn in their flesh. Some of the servants of the high priest had come with lanterns and torches, and they followed Judas, who was their guide. They were determined to find Jesus in case he had hidden in the night. By this time, everything is dark. It's dark on the mountain. It's dark in the streets, except those which were lit. But these men who came after Jesus had torches with them. They were determined to find him in case he tried to hide in the nighttime. So when he had prayed his third prayer, he heard the noise of the group coming up the mountainside, and he saw their lights approaching. He knew that his hour had come. But he had already prayed through until he was ready to meet the challenge. He knew all that was before him, and he calmly waited for the disciples to stand with him, and they went to meet his accusers. "Whom are you seeking?" he said. And one of them said, "We seek Jesus of Nazareth." "I am he," Jesus said. And knowing what these men had in their minds and the way that they wanted to shamefully treat Jesus, it was a bit disturbing to see that he was just announcing himself, letting them know who he was. Probably they had heard about his miracles, his signs, and his wonders, and they had known that he could do things that were not humanly possible, because the Lord himself was God, who had just laid down his divinity and walked in human flesh. But they knew he could perform miracles. They were a little bit concerned, and they did not proceed as boisterously as they might have. They didn't know but what he would call down 10,000 angels to deliver him from these terrorists who were bound and determined to get rid of him. But whenever he announced who he was, and Judas came forward to kiss him, that was the sign he had given to that group of men that he brought. They saw that nothing had happened to Judas, and so they felt it would be okay if they went ahead with their plans. He did not resist. He went along with them. They bound him. They mistreated him. They were just as cruel as men can be when they are far from God and allow the devil to rule their lives. Peter decided somebody needed to stick up for Jesus. And so he lunged at one of them and cut off the ear of one of the top men in that group. Jesus reprimanded him for doing so, and he took the ear and put it on back on that man and healed him. What a night. What a night. And so the answer to the question,
1 Timothy 6:10 states, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." What results might the love of money have had in Judas's life?
the thing that makes Judas' kiss the most dastardly in history is the attitude behind it. This was not a kiss of a disciple for his master. This was a kiss of betrayal, an attempt on the part of Judas to get even with Jesus. He even told the authorities to hold him fast. His love for money, that 30 pieces of silver, cost him eternity in hell. Subtopic B, Jesus is taken by force, and we're in the 48th verse of Mark 14.
"Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have to come out with the swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Question: what is dangerous about false accusations?
Jesus, he knew that if he so desired, he could immediately send up an SOS to his heavenly Father, who would dispatch a whole legion of angels to come and rescue him. But he had purposed in his heart that he would drink the cup, he said, which my Father has given me. He's bound, he's surrounded on all sides by his captors, and they kind of still feared that he would escape or be rescued. They're a little bit concerned. They know he can work miracles. So Jesus comes out with these words. "You come against me," he said, "as you might against a robber or an antagonist with swords and clubs. I sat day by day in the temple. I taught in the midst of the people. You had every opportunity to lay hold of me then, but you did nothing. In the darkness of night, this is what you planned. This is the powers of evil that work in the dark. But this is not happening by chance. It is only a fulfillment of the predictions by the prophets." And with that, he said no more and let them lead him away. The disciples saw that there was nothing they could do. He was not going to save himself, and they sure couldn't save him. And so they took flight as soon as they saw him in the hands of his enemies. There's an interesting story. There was a form of a man that hovered after them. He was white in the moonlight. He had covered with just a sleeping cover. And he had been roused from his sleep. So he was following Jesus, lagging along kind of towards the city. Some thought it might be Mark. But the soldiers had let the apostles flee, but they saw this guy that was following Jesus, attracted their attention, and they were going to grab him. And whoever the young man was, and some think that it might have been Mark, they just let him have his rap and he flew away, fled in the night, escaped out of their hands. Now, the plan that these murderers had was to hurry with the proceedings against their prisoner so quickly and come to a condemnation, condemning him, that the Romans would take over from there before the people could be roused to come to his aid. And so far, their plan had worked. The answer to the question,
what is dangerous about false accusations?
the danger against false accusations is that there has to be enough truth in the accusation to make it believable. So if you believe part of the accusation, then probably the rest of it is true as well. Is a human way of thinking, and that was the danger. Point 2, he is now come before the high priest. Please remember, the high priest is supposed to be the religious authority of the nation of Israel. He is supposed to lead them to God. So, our subtopic A is he is attacked by false testimony.
They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this case testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked, "Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Question: why did the Sanhedrin not carry out their death penalty?
Peter and another one of the apostles, and it was probably John, had followed the crowd from a distance, and John tells us that he was acquainted with the high priest. He had gone into a court with Jesus and had been instrumental in bringing in Peter, who was standing outside. And now we see Peter among the servants, and he's warming himself at their fire. In his 37th year, about 6 AD, Annas, A-N-N-A-S, was appointed a high priest by Quirinius, the governor of Syria. And then he was removed from that office about 15 AD by the governor of Judea. His 5 sons became high priest, and he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the present high priest. Annas and Caiaphas are described as being the high priest when John the Baptist began his public ministry. He's not really the high priest, Annas isn't, but he has held that position, and so probably that's why maybe he was the smarter of the two. I really don't know, but he was usually involved in affairs like this particular occasion, along with Caiaphas, the acting high priest. Annas could see Jesus. He could hear his defense. He could have the privilege of advising his son on how to react against the different situations. He had a snake-like craftiness. He was not a nice man, even though he had held the position of high priest. He thought maybe he might be able to help his less acute son-in-law. What passed before Annas, or what hints he sent to Caiaphas, we don't know, but we do know that they are taking Jesus to the high priest to see Caiaphas. It was before a mob of Jewish dignitaries that Jesus was brought, and they were awaiting his coming. They were there because they had such hatred in their heart against Jesus. They were going to make sure that they pronounced the death sentence on him and that they had condemned him, so that when they took him before Pilate, who was the government representative from Rome, he would have their assurance that this man was not worthy to live. They determined to put Jesus to death. It's almost unbelievable that men could have such hatred for one who had done nothing in his lifetime but good, heal the sick, cast out demons, perform miracles, let everybody know that the kingdom of heaven was near at hand, did nothing to deserve death. But it must be so, because it was prophesied by the prophets, and it was the means of you and me being able to have our sins forgiven and to be right in the eyes of the Father. So they hurried forward with the proceedings so quickly that they would have it all done in the nighttime hours before the people could be roused to come to his aid. So far, everything was going their way, but they couldn't find sufficient witnesses that would speak against him to be able to enact their plans. And so the high priest decided that he would get Jesus to incriminate himself, and he asked him, finally, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his clothes, and he cried, "He has blasphemed. What more do we need? We need to do whatever it takes to get rid of this man. Why do we need to hear more witnesses?" And so they all voted that further investigation was useless. On his own confession, Jesus was worthy of death. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, totally dark outside, and some hours must elapse before their decision could be formally ratified. The dark, silent night of the ancient city was disturbed many times before daybreak on that eventful occasion. And the answer to the question,
why did the Sanhedrin not carry out their death penalty?
Rome did not allow the Jewish Sanhedrin to carry out the death penalty. The Jewish court had to first condemn the prisoner from the testimony of 2 or more reliable witnesses, and then they could hand the prisoner over to Rome. Subtopic B of our point 2 is denied by Peter. And we're in the 65th verse of Mark 14.
Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said, but he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then the word Jesus had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Question: what should he or she do when they have failed Christ?
Jesus was left in charge of the rough temple police while the judges separated for an hour or 2. They probably needed a little bit of sleep for that night. And so that left those who were watching over Jesus to just mistreat him as much as they desired. They vented their cruelty on him with painful brutality. They blindfolded him, and then one struck him very viciously. They spit in his face and yelled, "Prophesy to us, Messiah." Who did that? He could have spoken one word, and those idiots would have perished. But as he began, he would end self-restrained in the use of his awful powers for his own behalf. He came to die for mankind, and he would become the supreme sacrifice for sin. It was chilly that night, and Peter sat in the courtyard among those around the fire. Didn't know what was going to happen. He was worried to death. He didn't know what was going to happen to him. One of the servant girls gazed at him steadily and said, "Aren't you also one of this man's disciples?" She wouldn't let him go, and she asked again, "You were with him, this Galilean?" And then she said to those that were standing around, "This fellow is also one of them." And he denied it the second time. And so those around him said to Peter, "You are a Galilean because your speech gives you away." That's when Peter lost all control. And for the 3rd time, he broke out in curses on himself and invoking evil upon himself if he had not spoken the truth that he knew nothing whatever about Jesus. While he's in the middle of that tirade, the sound of the rooster fell on his ears, and Jesus turned and looked at him in the face with loving but yet reproachful eyes. Peter went out and wept bitterly. The answer to the question,
what should he or she do when they have failed Christ?
This is one of my very favorite verses. It comes from James, the 5th chapter, in the 19th verse. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover a multitude of sins. Is it possible for a believer to backslide? Absolutely. Is it possible for a believer to go back into the sin from which he was brought out? Absolutely. What happens to him then? Unless he does as James wrote in chapter 5, verse 19, he will be lost eternally. For just because you accept Jesus once and you turn your back on him, you don't need to expect that you'll make heaven your home. But this verse says, if there is someone who will help you to get back on the straight and narrow, then you will be saved from death, and a multitude of sins will be covered. I love that verse. I want you to know there is hope for the backslider. And Peter found it himself. Subtopic 3 of our lesson today is entitled Before Pilate, and we're in Mark chapter 15. Subtopic A is entitled The King of the Jews.
Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of? But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Question: would the Romans have put Jesus to death for a religious crime?
Pilate is a Gentile. He is a Roman, and he has been placed over this area by the Roman government. He had heard about Jesus from various sources, even from his officials, and he had learned some things about him that were quite interesting. He avoided all appeals to force. His teachings had nothing political whatever in them, and his zeal was mainly directed against the Jewish priesthood and the public teachers. Pilate knew that he was now delivered up to the authorities, to the Roman authorities, just from envy and from their own selfish ends. They might have stoned Jesus for blasphemy, but they were resolved to leave the murderer and the hatred on Pilate and have Jesus, their victim, crucified. Crucifixion was a horrible way to die. Just absolutely horrible. In the fulfillment of the divine counsel, Jesus was to die. But he was not to die as a martyr to Jewish fury, but he was to die as a sin offering on the cross. Pilate was the governor and the representative of imperial Rome. He held this office from AD 26 to 36. And at this time, he was in Jerusalem. His home was in Caesarea, but he's in Jerusalem at this time to keep order during the feast. After the Jews had condemned Jesus in their own courts, they brought him early that morning to Pilate, who was probably residing in Herod's palace there by the temple. The Roman officials began their work early in the day, so he is hearing from the Jews. Now he has to make a decision. He does not really feel that Jesus is worthy of being condemned to death, but he's torn between offending the Jews and condemning an innocent person. Even his wife sent us a message, have nothing to do with that just man, because she said, I have been tormented through the night because of what's going on. Jesus knew that his enemies, the religious people, the top religious people, were determined that he should die, and they would invent charge after charge until he was destroyed. He knew that Pilate was fierce, but he knew that Pilate was a coward as well. When asked by Pilate if he was not going to answer to the accusations for his own defense, Jesus remained silent. The answer to the question,
would the Romans have put Jesus to death for a religious crime?
a theological question, was indifferent to the Romans, who cared nothing for religion. They would not put someone to death for their religious beliefs. Subtopic A, Barabbas is freed and Jesus is punished. 6th verse of Mark 15.
Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, Crucify him! Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Question: what was the religious festival the Jews were celebrating on this occasion?
On this occasion, it's been the Passover. In fact, Jesus and his disciples just had celebrated the Passover and had finished late that night and traveled up the Mount of Olives, where he prayed intensely those 3 times, and the crowds came to bring him to the authorities. It was custom for a release of a prisoner during the feast times. It was the practice that they would release one prisoner that would be condemned to death. The multitude, those that were outside the crowds, might name one person that was condemned to death in the prison system during the Passover week. So Pilate reminded them that he should release a prisoner. Barabbas was in prison. He had seemed to have taken a part in a tumult where there were people killed, and he was condemned. So Caiaphas, who is the high priest, and his priestly party went among all the crowd of people and stirred them up, asking that Barabbas be released instead of Jesus. So Pilate comes before the mob and he yells, "Which of the two do you wish me to release?" And the mob roared, "Barabbas, Barabbas." "What then shall I do with Jesus, whom you call the King of the Jews?" In answer to him came those awful words, "To the cross, crucify him, crucify him." John says that the Jews threatened, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. And that was the one thing that Pilate feared. He was directly responsible to the emperor, and he wanted to stay in his good graces. He controls Judea because of the favor of the Caesar. He was afraid that the Jews might report unfavorably to the Roman soldiers, and they would report to the emperor. So he ordered Jesus to be flogged with a lead-tipped whip, and then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. He has already been beaten. His face has been marred by those that hated him, slapped him, beat him. He's already gone through all kinds of torment and torture. But now he's going to be flogged. Victims condemned to the cross were first beaten, and Jesus is about to experience being beaten with knots of rope or braided leather thongs that had sharp pieces of bone or pieces of metal at the end of that whip on the ends of the thongs. It is said that not only was the back beaten and open in all directions, but even the eyes and the face and the breast were torn and cut, and in cases, teeth were even knocked out. Isaiah prophesied about 800 years previous, and he said, "His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form was marred beyond human likeness." That's found in Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 14. 800 years before it actually happened. Pilate had Jesus beaten, and then he handed him over to be crucified. The answer to the question,
What was the religious festival the Jews were celebrating on this occasion?
it was called the Feast of the Passover. It was celebrated on the 14th of April and commemorated the deliverance from Egyptian bondage and the establishment of Israel as a nation by God's redemptive act. You just have to think of the old song, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." We can be born again. We can be brought into fellowship with God Almighty because there was a cross and there was a crucifixion. There was a death and blood was shed on our behalf. Thanks be unto God who gives the victory over sin again and again. The title for our next lesson is Jesus' Death and His Resurrection. Have a great week, and God bless you.